Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I am Puja Vaish, the director of the JNF, which is the Jehangir Nicholson Art Foundation in Mumbai. The foundation forms the modern and contemporary art wing of the CSMVS Museum, which was formerly known as the Prince of Wales Museum. The JNF collection comprises post-independence Indian art collected over 40 years by Jehangir Nicholson, one of the earliest private collectors in India. So, on behalf of the JNAF, I welcome you to the third and concluding talk of our series, Mind the Dash, the Modern, Contemporary, and the In-Between in Indian Art. This series is presented by the JNAF in collaboration with the Peabody Essex Museum. It is a set of conversations with Dr. Zehra Jumabhoy, Dr. Siddhartha Shah, and myself. Zehra is a UK-based art historian, lecturer, and curator specializing in South Asian art. She guest curated the first international institutional exhibition dedicated to the Progressive Artist Group at the Asia Society Museum in New York. Zehra has also been a consultant for the recent rehang of the Hurwitz collection at the Peabody Essex Museum. Siddharth is a curator of Indian and South Asian art at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, that houses the Chester and Davida Hurwitz collection of post-independence art from India. He has spent the past 2 years reinterpreting and reinstalling the collection, which opens to the public this November. So to recap, over the last couple of sessions, we spoke about collections and artworks from post-Indian independence through different lenses. The first session was titled The Modern in the Contemporary Space, and it featured the Hurwitz, Nicholson, and the TIFR collections. We explored these collections through the stories that come through from the collections, the art ecosystems of the times, the relationship between collectors and artists, and of the finds within the collections that sometimes tell a different story from dominant narratives in art history. It has been our effort through this series to also explore multiple readings and connections through a careful looking or a relooking or at artworks, artists, trajectories, and art historical categorizations such as the modern and the contemporary. The second session was titled Woman and Myth or Man and Myth, where we spoke about the representation of mythic forms in art. We did this through an analysis of fact and fiction, abstraction and figuration, and the conflation between religion, politics, art, state, and censorship. So one of the main reasons for conceptualizing this series is to bridge divides by bringing scholars, collections, and artworks together. And this has been made possible virtually through the current pandemic situation. So besides Zehra, who's joining us from the UK, Siddharth from the US, and I from India, we have a special guest speaker today, Dr. Sameena Igbal, who is joining us from Lahore, Pakistan. Even if travel were permitted, it would be next to impossible to have this conversation in the physical space, given the strained political relationship between our two countries. So due to our shared pre-partition histories, I believe this is going to be quite an insightful conversation in constructing a more holistic narrative of the modern in the subcontinent and the possible connections. Dr. Sameena Igbal is a practicing artist, art historian, and an academic. She received her PhD in art historical studies from the Virginia Commonwealth University, Richmond. Her research interest is South Asian and contemporary art, and her doctorate was on the study of modern art in Pakistan in the first decade of its establishment through a small artist collective called the Lahore Art Circle. Samina is currently assistant professor in the Center of Media Studies, Art and Design at the Lahore School of Economics, Pakistan. So a very warm welcome to you, Samina. We also have today Mortimer Chatterjee, who was our guest speaker and moderator for the first session, and who has kindly agreed to moderate for us again today. Mort is gallerist of Chatterjee and Lal Gallery in Mumbai. He has also researched institutional and corporate collections in India, and he has co-authored a book with Tara Lal on the TIFR collection. So welcome back, Mort. Lastly, I would like to mention that the series is comprised of visual presentations by each of us. So there's lots of art to see. And for each of the sessions, we have chosen a specific image as a visual metaphor. And so for this session, we have a work by Raza from the JNF collection titled Zameen, which means ground or earth or land in Urdu and also in syncretic colloquial Hindi. So this work was created at a time when further partition of the land was taking place, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh in 1971. This work also marks an important shift in the artist's practice when Raza was making several trips to India from Paris, increasingly returning to and identifying with the landscape of his childhood in Madhya Pradesh. So this is probably one of the first of the series of the works that he created, which is evocative of the land and forest, and also of the symbolism and abstraction, integrating his childhood experiences and his idea of Indian cultural heritage before the Bindu works. It's a monumental work. It's almost 10 feet by 6 feet, and the chosen one for our session today, which is titled Collectives, Composites, and Collaborations. I will now give it over to Mort, who is our moderator. So thank you.
Puja, thanks so much for that fantastic introduction, and welcome everybody. I think you've really said it all in terms of recapping the first two sessions. And I think really I'm so excited to be here for a second time, because I feel that what you, Siddhartha and Zehra, have done very nicely is set up a platform to recontextualize some of the important issues around modern art in the contemporary moment. And you've done it in a way that is surprising, is novel, and is bringing new resonances, which I think perhaps haven't been talked about, discussed often enough. I think to finish your sessions with, in a sense, looking beyond India, looking at the idea of borders, both within, and I know, Puja, you're going to be talking about this, within one's own artistic practice, but then all more literally within the borders of nationhood, and even looking at the diaspora art community, which I think Siddhartha will touch upon, is a brilliant way of kind of packaging the series, which really has been about subverting orthodox histories. And as you know, in my own work with the collection of the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, that's something which I'm really interested in doing, because I think it's about time that we unpack some of the assumptions that we've kind of built into a lot of the received histories of the period. I don't think I want to say too much more at this point, Puja. I think it would be nice if we jumped into the sessions themselves. I know that I'm really excited to listen to Samina's lecture, which I think I'll learn a lot about what was happening in Pakistan at the outset. But prior to that, if I'm right in saying, Puja, we're going to start with Zehra.
Yeah, yes, yes.
Yeah, and so Zehra is also going to be, I think, touching on some of this timeline around the point of independence and the different scenes that were active between India and Pakistan. Zehra, can I leave it to you to take it away, and then I'll be in touch with everyone after Zehra's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mort. Yeah, so like everyone else, I'm really, really excited. We've got Samina with us today because it adds a sort of completely different dimension as to the modern and the contemporary that we've been discussing most exclusively in an Indian context. And so having Samina here today also allows us to introduce the Pakistani dynamic and a few reflections which my talk will have on Bangladesh as well. And I'm coming to that very shortly. But I think if there is a sort of takeaway from these talks, then maybe those takeaways can be about, as Mort said, sort of rethinking some of the traditional dialogues that we've had about ideas of the contemporary, about the modern, about relationships between public and private collections, but also, and this is my argument today, you know, if we look at Indian modernism in the context of partition and in the context of the other South Asias like Pakistan and Bangladesh, in fact, there's a lot that you can learn just about the Indian modern. And so what I'm going to be doing today, hopefully, if I can share my screen, sharing. Is to give you a small taste of what very quickly that might actually look like. So the central point that I'm exploring as a sort of setup for Samina coming on and sort of continuing this with a very specific example is that you know, how is there a way of looking at the Indian modern in the context of partition? And what does that actually add? You know, what does the other nation that so far in our sort of dialogues about the Indian modern has been almost sort of suppressed, repressed? What does that acknowledgement of its presence do to our readings of existing works? And not just our readings, but ironically also the readings of the artists themselves who made it. So I'm going to give you a couple of case studies on well, particularly on Christian Khanna, but I'm also going to sort of just take you through three little snapshots. I love the three thing of ways in which this sort of the other nation of Pakistan, you know, can be read into the Indian modern and what it does for us. So obviously here you have Nalini Malani, who is Indian, and Iftikhar Dadi, who is Pakistani, and their joint work, collaborative work called Bloodlines from 1997. The work that we have that I'm showing you over here is actually a sort of, it's like a Zari work. And in fact, it's not the one that was made in 1997 because that one was lost. And so this is a reconstruction. But the reason I'm just using it is because, what is it? It's actually the Radcliffe line. So since the theme today is very, for me at least, is very much, you know, how does partition affect our reading of the Indian moderns? I just wanted to show you what is the partition that I'm talking about. So very quickly, this is the map of the subcontinent and the Radcliffe line. So you can see that these are exactly the two lines. What is the Radcliffe line? The Radcliffe line is what actually in 1947 creates East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And of course, we know that East Pakistan over here is what we now call Pakistan, and sorry, West Pakistan over here is what we now call Pakistan, and this is East Pakistan, which is now since 1971 Bangladesh. Okay, so a few things going back to, trying to get rid of my face. Going back very, very briefly to the show that I guess curated with Tan Wenhui at the Asia Society, and here's a setup for it. And you can see the 6 people at of the Progressive Artist Group, the original 6 of the Progressive Artist Group. And the reason I'm just sort of setting the stage for this is because when Samina comes on, she's going to very specifically talk about the Lahore Art Circle, which is the exact shadow of this group, in the sense that they very much use the progressives as their blueprint, but we'll be hearing more of that shortly. What am I doing? Okay, so outside this exhibition, I'd actually put up a little excerpt from a newspaper cutting that we found in 1949, and this was Souza's article, What Makes Progressive Art. So this is one of the things that we might potentially be exploring today, is to the concept of the progressive and how it works throughout the South Asias. And something really, really interesting about this article is that in What Makes Progressive Art, Souza actually is really critical of the concept of the progressive, and which is quite ironic because, you know, this article is timed to coincide with the Progressive Artist Group first sort of inaugural shows in Baroda and Bombay in 1949, and yet you have him going, can the gulf between the people and artists really be bridged? And he talks about the fact that the term progressive is really not very representative of, it's too left-leaning, it's too Marxist, and maybe we should rethink the whole concept of the modern and its relationship with progress. But then at the same time, typically Souza, he signs off as the secretary of the Progressive Artist Group. So one of the words that is kind of in play in this context of the modern is progressive, and it's contentious right from the start, is what I want to tell you. But something else that I want you to remember, which is like really quite important and connected to this notion of the modern with progress on one side, the progressive on one side, but on the other side for India, the terminology of the secular. So when I did a joint conference with Professor Faisal Devji at Oxford a couple of years ago, and we were thinking about names for this conference. It was a sort of 70 years of Indian and Pakistani independence conference. And one of the words that I was very keen to include in the name of that conference was the word secular. And Faisal was like, no, what you don't understand is that the word secular is actually a word that was invented to exclude Pakistan. Now, I think, you know, my research since then has sort of put that a little bit in inverted commas and somewhat under doubt. But what I do want to pay attention to here is that, you know, in 1947, with the Radcliffe Line, with partition, two nations were born. And the two nations, as we know, were a secular India, that was the rubric, and a Muslim Pakistan, that was also the rubric. And so in many ways, the Progressive Artist Group, because of their very plural composition, became a sort of a kind of an anchor for this very version of a secular India, which is, whether we like it or not, very much defined in the 40s and the 50s as against a Muslim Pakistan. And so it then becomes inevitable that for the Progressive Artist Group, that, you know, the sort of quintessential moderns for this group, the kind of poster boys, should be two Muslim artists, one being Hussein and one being Raza, both of who we've discussed before. And what I kind of want to just point out to you over here is that there's a reason that, you know, that they would be Muslim and they would become the poster boys for a sort of secular India, because it's a way of flagging out that, you know, Pakistan is just defined on religion, it's defined as Muslim, but, you know, oh, us Indians, that's a different, it's a completely different dialogue. We're secular, so we're inclusive, and therefore Raza and Hussein become really important to this particular dialogue. What I'm going to do in the remainder of this talk very quickly is in some ways upend this dialogue, and to show you that actually, despite this sort of attribution of kind of a secular India that excludes Pakistan, the Progressive Artist Group, both first and second wave, all had dealings and relationships with Pakistan. And that in fact, these relationships are very important to how we read them in retrospect. So one very quick thing that I'm going to be showing you now is a project that Samina and I have been sort of collaborating on, which is actually joining the dots between what were the progressives up to versus what were the Lahore Art Circle up to in the 40s and the 50s, and also using the collection of Temur Hassan in London to very much kind of make our dialogues about compare and contrast about these major Indian and Pakistani moderns and what actually they might have shared. And just to point out to you that this is not easy to do in either just Pakistan, or it's virtually impossible to do in India. So if it wasn't for people like Temur, who open up their collections in London, to Samina and me going and reading it basically, and trying to like do all of these readings from his walls, this sort of a project and this kind of a collaboration would never happen. And so it's a shout out to Timur, but also to note that it's important that these do happen because we learn things. And one of the things that I want to point out over here, Samina will come and talk quite a lot about Shakir Ali in the context of the Lahore Art Circle, and we've already talked about Hussain in terms of the Progressive Artist Group and Quintessential Modernity. And just to show you that in fact these two key members of these two groups, if you look at their work, there is a synchronicity. And the reason that I picked these two things up, both of them belong to Timur, is that you can actually see the visual synchronicity. And part of the reason for this is because, of course, both of them were heavily influenced by Cubism. And in the case of Shakir Ali, like Ram Kumar, was associated with the Progressive Artist Group, Shakir Ali and Ram Kumar both studied under André Lot, so in Paris. So who was sort of had a major influence on South Asian Cubism. So there are lots of sort of visual affiliations that you can draw from this kind of collaborative reading. The other thing that we can actually do is find out all of these kind of sort of hidden stories about the Indian progressives. So who knew, before this period, it hadn't really occurred to me the extent to which when Sousa leaves Britain in 1967, he goes to New York. And actually this is a very bad career move for him. He really never is accepted. It's a wrong dialogue in New York for him. And in many ways, Sousa's rehabilitation happens because of Pakistan. So Ali Imam, who again Samina will come and talk about, is actually the brother of S.H. Raza. And I won't say more than the fact that Ali Imam founds a gallery in Karachi called the Indus Gallery. And this gallery throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s hosts a series of progressive artist group and affiliated members. And one of the people who goes often, and hence there's a large collection of Sousa in Karachi and Lahore, is Sousa, of course. And this is a work again from Temur Hassan's walls, both of these, but Temur has got some amazing collections of 70s mosques by Sousa. And this is the famous white period of Sousa, that just like the black period, Sousa claimed that he destroyed them and didn't really want to talk about them, but they're now resurfacing. And it's really interesting that this absolutely, really, really intriguing work should be of a mosque and should be of a period where Sousa is most active in Pakistan. And this is again something that, one just wouldn't know without these kind of collaborations. The other thing, and now I'm going to go quite quickly, is to point out to you that another way in which, we can sort of read Pakistan and read partition in the dialogue of the Indian moderns is something that I experimented with and tried just a little tasting portion in the show in New York. And so what I did was that I put the Taib Mehta diagonal from the 1970s next to this work by Krishan Khanna. And the reason that I did this was, of course, to create an alternative dialogue and to draw attention to the fact that while the moderns have often, the Indian moderns have often been called derivative of Western modernism, and often Taib Mehta talked about his work in the context of, going to the US and seeing Bart McNewman's zip paintings, and this is why in the 70s you have the introduction of the diagonal in his work. But my reading is, and I'm not alone in this, someone like Sonal Kolar has also talked quite a lot about this, Sumati Ramaswamy, but I just want to sort of specifically locate this and say that in the 70s, you have a whole spate of diagonal slashes entering into the work of the progressives. You see it with Hussein, you see it especially with Taib Mehta. And the reason for this, of course, these diagonal slashes and the reintroduction of a faint map, even in the most sort of abstract works, is my reading is that actually they're not really just formal choices. They're actually highly influenced by partition. And what partition am I talking about? The 1971 partition of the second partition, the formation of Bangladesh in 71, where East Pakistan draws away from West Pakistan, and you have Bangladesh coming into being. And if you look at these kind of diagonals, you can see very clearly that it's not really just a formal choice because of Barton and Newman. It actually has to do with a revisiting a primal trauma that would have been partition. And this is where I'm coming to my next little bit. So here again, you have Krishan Khanna, the anatomy lesson. And my argument very much is, if you look very closely at what the generals are sort of cutting up and slicing, it is actually, it's a 72 work. It is actually the map of Bangladesh. So here you can see like little waves and things. I mean, there are people who think I'm completely nuts and I see maps where there aren't any, but I think there's a good case here to see them. And now I'm getting to my end game arguments to make way for Samina. But it is, it's sort of this end game kind of like encapsulates what I'm trying to say, which is that if you read the work of the moderns in the context of partition, and if you allow them in the 70s a view of looking at the formation of Bangladesh, what you actually see in their work is the fact that Bangladesh becomes a kind of fulcrum. So the second partition becomes a kind of fulcrum, a sort of unlocking, where in a way they are able suddenly in formal terms to do something that they had never really been able to do before, which is to talk about the first partition, the 1947, the sort of primal partition. And you can see that very clearly now and with where I'm going with Krishan Khanna. So Krishan Khanna, as we know, he was the second generation of the second wave of the progressive artist group, the 1953 one. He was born in 1925 in Faisalabad, now Pakistan. And Khanna grew up in Lahore, only studying art after he graduated from college at evening classes held at the Mayo School of Art there. Now, the Mayo School of Art is now known as the National College of Art in Lahore. In 1947, Khanna's family moved to Shimla as a result of the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan. Now, look very carefully at this work, Black Truck. It's done in the 70s. What am I going to say? It's actually very influenced by Bangladesh, right? Now, I have a little quote for you from 2014, when Krishan Khanna came to speak at the Courtauld Institute of Art on a panel with Connor McLean from Grosvenor Gallery and Kajali Khanna, of course, who is his granddaughter. And we sort of really pressed Krishan at this point. And when he showed this image called Death in the Afternoon, he didn't show this one, but he showed Death in the Afternoon, 1947. And we really sort of pressed him about, why did that talk not mention the 1947 partition at all? And, this is what he said, okay? These are his words. So Christian said, the partition was a monstrous, terrible thing. That happened. When one is afflicted with such a situation, you do not sit down and start painting it. You let it metabolize within you. I am still in the process of painting those paintings. So he refused to be drawn on Death in the Afternoon. And, we did mention Tara Devi as well. He didn't, but he refused to be drawn on it. He said, no, these are not partition paintings. I'm that's not what I'm doing. However, right, these works were made. And what's even more interesting is that when they went on auction at Saffron Art, the reading that they were given, the little blurb on the Saffron Art site, talks about, and this is Gayatri Sinha, who's written a critical biography for Videra Art Gallery, okay? And this is what the Saffron Art site quotes. It says, by 1947, Khanna's involvement in painting was virtually total, with poetry being relegated to consuming if private pleasure. He attempted several different styles. The rather naive composition, landscape around Tara Devi, was followed by the expressionistic Dead Tree, also 1947. And I think actually Dead Tree, this is Death in the Afternoon that is being discussed, which won him a commendation at the Punjab Fine Arts and Crafts Society. So the entire blurb talks about formal properties of this work. Nowhere in this blurb is partition, and the fact that 1947 is a really significant date, and the works do gesture to partition, to death, mentioned at all, right? Now, however, Rima Gehi does this really, really interesting article at the start of lockdown, with the sort of horrible migrations that happened because of certain people's policies during COVID, and using this as a sort of benchmark, it seemed to unlock something within Christian Khanna. And so he starts talking about an early work he made, which is actually found by Kajali Khanna and her dad in the sort of archives. And this is the work. It's Refugee Train. So this is not a work Christian Khanna had ever really mentioned before, but Kajali finds this and starts prodding him. And he gives this interview to Rima Gehi. And he says, nobody knew where they were going after partition. This image of refugees waiting at a train station for 18 hours remained with me, and the memory came alive on canvas. So suddenly he starts talking about this work. And what's even more interesting for this same article is this work begins to then trigger a rereading of the 1970s truck work. So this work, and this work which I've sort of mentioned over here, right? Which all the way in 2015, he says, no, I'm not talking about partition. But now, after this trigger, he says, this is another image I painted from memory, nearly 3 decades after witnessing it. Partition didn't happen over a day. The migration happened over several days, weeks, months. Animals and people, along with their belongings, were all shoved inside trucks and moved from place to place. So this is what I want to say, that if we acknowledge the presence of a Pakistan, if we acknowledge the fact that, partition is there, and we start looking at works that we're really, really familiar with, in the light of it, what we actually come up with are different readings. And perhaps this is about the time to sort of unlock unlock memories, unlock ways of dealing with that primal partition that really, people haven't done before, and even the artists haven't done before. But now in retrospect, Krishan Khanna is doing just that. And if we relook at previous works in the light of this, perhaps this is what, this is one of the readings we can actually do of them. And so I'm just going to end here and let Samina take over. So just to tell you, this is the Zameen that Puja mentioned, which we used by Raza, 1971. Haha. So what am I going to say? It's actually subtly about Bangladesh. And even though the colors are rather like sort of the Indian flag, one could almost say that the sort of bindu could equally be a sort of, the bindu also figures on the Bangladeshi flag. And so all of these readings kind of political reality can kind of complicate the way in which we look at the formalism of the moderns. And that's all from me.
Zehra, can I just ask, have you seen the Raza painting where he, I think it's 1971, 72, where it is essentially the Bangladeshi flag with the red bindu?
Yes, yeah.
So would that also perhaps play into that continuation of your argument that in some ways these artists are using the second partition as a way of returning to the trauma of the first?
Yes, absolutely. And also, like, it's something that I'll be looking at like a lot for an article I did for a Harvard book on partition. And actually it's the functioning of post-memory and Marian Hirsch's term of post-memory, and the fact that, first generation very often cannot find the visual vocabulary to express something. But my point is that it's not just the second and the third generation that can bring themselves to revisit this sort of primal trauma, which out of something that is not their memory, but a reconstructed memory. But also that if we re-look at the work of the moderns, and perhaps there are things in there where actually this memory is dealt with, but it's dealt with very obliquely. And it's only now the ones that are alive are saying, actually, that's what it was all about.
That's absolutely fascinating. And I think that there's obviously so much rich material just waiting to be revisited now out of this new reading that you've given it. Thank you so much, Zehra. And I think we can return to a lot of this after everyone has spoken. If I may, Samina, can I ask you now to deliver your presentation, which we're all very excited for. So Samina, without further ado, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Mort, and thank you, Puja, Siddhartha, Zehra. I'm really excited. This is the first time I'm presenting my research to Indian audience. So of course, it's just very exciting. And I'm very glad, and like Puja said, even if there was not COVID, I wouldn't be able to come to India. So thank you for creating this opportunity. So let me start with my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So following up on Zehra's presentation, I'm going to present a parallel view of modern art movement, and I would want to say specifically abstract modern art movement in the newly established Pakistan. We are a small group of artists which was called as Lahore Art Circle, founded in 1952. So I will first like to establish the conditions that led to the founding of Lahore Art Circle, and then I will posit that Lahore Art Circle saw itself parallel to the influential avant-garde Bombay Progressive, and it was modeled after that. I proceed to define what modern art meant for Lahore Art Circle, and last but not least, establish the cross connections between the two collectives, because of which I have come up to the conclusion that it was modeled after Bombay Progressives, and how they were similar and different from each other simultaneously. So Zehra, very nicely, thank you. You set up the context for me. You talked about the partition. So without going too much into the details of the historic partition of 1947, I would just start by saying that the first decade of Pakistan's establishment was traumatic in every respect. Everything was in flux. Millions of people migrated across the border, both sides. So these millions of migrants which came which crossed the border and came to Pakistan and settled in the new country. Among these millions of artists, migrant people were several artists who ended up settling in big cities, including Lahore and Karachi. So I would like to give you a first big picture of like what the art scene looked like for Pakistan. So, this is the, these are the three major cities that I'm marking here with the artistic situation. Lahore is, of course, the center of all kinds of intellectual and cultural activities, and I'll come back to it in a second because this is the focus of my talk today. So we have Karachi, where Qaid-e-Azam, so when we are looking at Lahore, stepping back, so we have Mayo School of Art and Craft, which is now known as National College of Arts, Lahore, where Abdur Rahman Chughtai is already an established artist. He's 51 years old at the time of partition. We have Ustad Allah Bakhsh, who's like the epitome of like, the master of like miniature painting. We have the art department at the Punjab University, where Anna Molka, an amazing figure, which I feel like has been really not much research. She's the one who's really kind of taking the burden of like promoting art in Pakistan. Then I have the last one is Zubaida Agha, which I'll come back in a second and want to talk about, a loner in this whole scene that we will look at. You have in Karachi Faizi Rahameen, who was actually Qaid-e-Azam's Muhammad Ali Jinnah's friend and neighbor. He requested him and settled him in Karachi so that he can initiate an art activities in this industrial city of Karachi. The third city is in East Pakistan, Dhaka, which is now Bangladesh. And there we are looking at Zainul Abidin, who's the modern painter there. So going forward, like, now that I want to zoom into Lahore a little bit, and I want to talk about why this is the locus of my talk. So briefly describing the city Lahore, where it is located, to contextualize how and why it became the center for intellectual discourse. Because of its geographical location, size, and rich history, Lahore has been a center of artistic and cultural activities for centuries in Western Punjab, just like Calcutta was in West Bengal in colonial India. Lahore houses some of the most beautiful Mughal architecture, including the Badshahi Mosque, Shalimar Garden, the Mausoleum of the Mughal Empire Jehangir, Lahore Fort, and many more. These are just to name a few. The presence of these monuments indicates that Lahore was an all-time favorite for many kings, emperors of the Mughal Empire, and ambitious and thoughtful individuals even before India was colonized. Lahore is considered as home to the artistic and intellectual elites of the Indian subcontinent in colonial India and even today. It is usually described as a city of gardens, colleges, poets, and newspapers. Since the 1920s, the largest number of Urdu literary journals, newspaper, and books, as well as the best English language dailies, have been published from Lahore. Its well-known publication includes Lahore Chronicle, Civil and Military Gazettes, Tribune, and many more. Even today, the city generates 8% of publications in Pakistan. Returning to the art scene of Pakistan, where I had just talked about, like, what we inherited at the time of partition were these two sort of institute. So when I presented the first picture and I said the three major city, but I'm taking you back for a moment, at the time of partition. So Mayo School of Art comes to us, we have Abdur Rahman Chughtai already, a very well-established artist whose work was already being published in India, in Indian magazines. I'm talking about, like, when I'm saying India for today. So we have Ustad Allah Bakhsh, who was also working. Haji Muhammad Sharif is also another artist who's expert in miniature painting. All three of them were teaching at Mayo School of Art. And parallel to that, so right across Mayo School of Art, we have the art department at the Punjab University. This is like physically they are right across each other, where Anna Molka, who was a British woman, married to an Indian subcontinent person, Sheikh Ahmed, she was married to him. So she was the one who was running this Punjab department. So after the establishment, Chughtai becomes the face of Pakistani art scene, because, like I said, he was 51 years old when Pakistan was established, and his work was very well established before the partition. So let me show what is happening other than Chughtai, like, what is it that, we're looking at the art scene. So this just gives you sort of like an overview. So I talk about Allah Bakhsh, who's really following the European academic style of painting, also teaching at Neo School of Art. Anna Molka is across the road. She's teaching at the Punjab University, and her style is post-impressionist. We look at Abdurrahman Chughtai, which I already talked about, and I'm going to show you a sample of few of their works. We have Haji Sharif, that I already established was a miniature artist. Zubaida Aga, I'm going to come back to it, and I want to give you a little bit more context on her. She's somebody who was not trained as an artist at all. She did her simple graduation in philosophy from the college in Lahore, Canadian College, Lahore. And then she decided to, she got interested in art and she wanted to learn art. And this is where she started her journey. And I will come back and talk a little bit about her. So in the middle, I have Shakir Ali, who actually returns in 1951. So let me just go over and talk about this in a second. So when we have the, Ustad Allah Bakhsh, we call him Ustad because, he's really considered as the master, meant craftsman, not really a fine artist. So basically, Chughtai's figure becomes larger than life, and, he's the most prominent figure here. So let me just show you some of the samples of these works. So you look at Haji Sharif's work, and then you have Abdurrahman Chughtai, who's really associated with this kind of Mughal Persian nostalgia of past Muslim glory. We look at Allah Bakhsh's work, where, like I mentioned, it's really inspired by the European academic style. He was also self-taught. Faizi Rahmin that I mentioned was settled in Karachi. He also sort of followed pretty much kind of in between of like what Chughtai was doing, but then also, his individual style, like looking at Bengal school as well. Anna Molka is at the bottom right here. So, and then we look at Zainul Abidin, who's in Dhaka, who's minimalist drawing and who's also very much established before partition. Zubaida Aga on the right side, and I want to talk a little bit more about her because she's the first woman artist in Pakistan who in 1949 held first exhibition and was met by huge resistance by the public. Nobody was willing to accept the kind of work she was producing, which was completely, the language was abstract art. So this is just a little introduction. So I had to mention Zubaida Aga again because I feel like, she's outside the Lahore art circle that I'm going to talk about. But, I would argue that, she should be considered as the pioneer of introducing modern art in Pakistan, modern abstract art in Pakistan. So let me just take you back to where I'm going. So this is Zubaida Aga. So this was like, her first exhibition in 1949 that she showed in Karachi and had very harsh reviews that she received, which almost considered her work. So like taking you back for a second to show you her work, it was considered as like, adult art types, So this was a review written by Faizi Rahmin's wife, one of the artist's wife. And she said like, it's not really acceptable, the kind of art she's making. So basically she's making the audience fool with the kind of art she's producing. I'm giving you this picture so that, you have the context to understand that, when the Lahore Art Circle comes in, how is it like, taking away from what is happening already before that. So indeed the formative years of Pakistan were centered in Lahore. So this Park Tea House that you see on the screen, and there was another coffee house which was across Park Tea House. It was located on Mall Road. It becomes the vibrant focal point of intellectual discussions and natural meeting place for writers, poets, and artists. So this is a place where all kinds of people come and gather and they have a cup of tea and they converse and they exchange views. And it is within this scene when Shakir Ali, who was 31 years old when he decides to come back to Pakistan. He was born in North India, in Rampur, and he, at the time of partition, he was studying in Europe. So he decides to deliberately take Pakistani citizenship and returns to Pakistan in 1951. He makes an entry to the artistic and intellectual scene of art, and it just completely shifts and changes things in Pakistan. So being the first Pakistani artist trained in the West in terms of abstract modern art, he quickly became the center of attention for the young, energetic artists of Lahore. Initially with 5 young artists, he founded this group. So these 5 young artists are Muin Najmi, Anwar Jalal Shamza, Sayyid Ali Imam, Sheikh Safdar Ali, and Amit Pervez. And then you see the other 2 women artists, which is Razia Feroz and Mariam Shah. And I'll tell you why I have named them in a little bit of orange, because when I focused on my PhD research, I focused on the 6 men, and I didn't include these 2 women's work in the research, and I'll tell you why in a little bit of time. So these artists that we are looking at the screen, Shakir Ali is the only one who's well versed in Bengal school style, European academic style, and then he goes to Europe to study further. So then he also studied, like Zehra said, under Andre Lotz. Sayyid Ali Imam is the brother of Sayyid Haider Raza, who's the member of Bombay Progressives. And he's the younger brother, Sayyid Ali Imam. And Sayyid Ali Imam, when partition happened, he was forced by the family to come back, to move to Pakistan. When he moved to Pakistan, before moving to Pakistan, he was taking evening classes at JJ School of Art, and he really didn't have that kind of formal training. When he came to Pakistan, he went for simple BA, didn't go for another art education again here, but he continued to paint. Anwar Jalal Shamza was somebody who was born in Kashmir, and he belonged to this business family where, carpet business family, where, he was already very familiar with the world of color and design and all of these things. Anwar Jalal Shamza came to Pakistan actually first to study in 1946, and he came to study at Punjab University, philosophy and Persian. But he changed his mind, and he went to Mayo School of Art and got a diploma in commercial design. So he's the only one besides Shakir Ali who's formally trained in an art school. Muin Najmi is another artist who was also pretty much self-trained, but he had some training with a Russian artist who was based in Shimla and would come to Lahore sometimes. So he had some training with him, but no formal training in terms of getting a diploma or going to a college. Sheikh Safdar Ali was also the same trajectory. He is actually well known in Pakistan as a designer, but not as a painter. But he's the one who's really prolifically painting, once he starts learning these things. And, he sits in this circle and, learns to draw and paint while being in the company of these people. Amit Pervez is the last artist that I give a little bit more of a description here. He was trained with his uncle, who was based in Lahore, and he was trained in European academic style, and he hated it. And there are many, letters from him, writings where he talks about, how he hated the training, where he was compelled to draw and, paint in a realistic manner. And he just really did not like that. Razia Feroz, Mariam Shah, both of these women, they studied at Punjab University under Anna Molka. And the reason I didn't include them in my research was because their stylistic the work style was very different from the rest of the group. But for me, it is important to include them because Mariam Shah, so now that I'm working on the manuscript of my book, I'm furthering my research on their work as well. Mariam Shah hardly painted. I think when I talked to the family, they said that, there were only probably about 10 to 12 paintings that, she made. Razia Feroz, on the other hand, was painting quite a bit, but quite a loner in that sense. For them to be present in the group and, what their role was, that is something that needs a little bit more in-depth research. Mariam Shah was really supporting the group in terms of writing for them in the newspaper, giving reviews of their exhibition, and also buying their work. So, I thought I should just mention you in here. So, this is an exhibition poster that I'm showing you here, which just shows the, Lahore Art Circle, the people, how they were, showing the work. Never did they all show all together the work. So one of the things I want to quote a couple of quotes for the formation of Lahore Art Circle. So Safdar Mir, a professor of English literature at Government College Lahore, he brilliantly captured the condition that led to the founding of Lahore Art Circle. He states, and I quote, Shakir joined the Muse School of Art and what is more important, came across a small group of very young and very violent enthusiasts of painting. These young painters had similar problems and a similar attitude towards their solution. They're all iconoclasts, individualists, and breakers of traditions, mad. They were young, they believed in doing whatever they pleased. New experiences and an expanded scope had come their way. A new nation was trying to forge itself into a unity to face the challenges of freedom. So I end quote. I want to mention here that all the Lahore Art Circle members, they were practicing art in the prevalent style, what I showed you before. So for instance, when I mentioned you, like Sayyid Ali Imam was also painting in kind of like European academic style. So was Amit Pervez. A.J. Shamsa was following the Bengal school style. So each one of them previously had their own style of painting, which was really based on the prevalent practices that I showed as examples for you. So there is another quote that Safdar Mir says about these artists, and I quote, the young Pakistani artist felt that what they had inherited from their past was too static, self-satisfied, smug, non-violent, and vegetarian. The colors washed too often and gave an impression of bleaching. The lines melodious, sugary, cloying, velvety, flowing, and metaphysically inane. The art of painting expressed none of the conflicts and tensions that none of the conflicts and tensions of a vigorous community facing the challenges of the post-World War. So when I showed you the slide of the prevalent trends, the idea was that, this is where they are taking the break from. So because they were either confined to mimetic representation or romantic and allegorical views of the glorious past of Muslim, that was limited and could not address a wider audience across the globe. Furthermore, the idea of producing an art of pretty pictures in the traditional painting practices during such a time of chaos, unrest, and anxiety for the future must have seemed out of place and unreal. For them, the real task was not to recall the past, but to move the art practices in Pakistan towards a progressive direction, compatible with the rest of the world. So as Zehra was mentioning, so I'm showing you what happens when after the formation of Lahore Art Circle. I forgot to mention, so Shakir Ali is the faculty at Muse School of Art, which later becomes the National College of Arts, Lahore. None of these artists are either working or studying at Muse School of Art. So Shamsa had graduated in 1947 and he had gone back to India, and he had to come back when migration happened, he settles in Lahore. So this is what happens when the partition happens. If I had longer time, and I would show you some examples of their previous works as well, but this was a complete break from what they were doing before. So because, like Zehra was mentioning, at a crucial time when India was just liberated from colonial rule and separated into the two nations of India and Pakistan, Bombay Progressive was redefining Indian modernism in its own terms and in dialogue with the movement of international modernism. So similarly, the Lahore Art Circle was doing the same thing. Never would they claim as their art to be Islamic, and never would they be claimed as not acknowledging the existence of Pakistan. So they were kind of placed in this precarious situation where they were sort of balancing. They were not ignoring the fact. I mean, you can imagine, because 4 of them migrated from India to Pakistan, they were not ignoring the fact that they are living in the new nation, but they also realized the need that, now is the time. How do we break away from the past? How do we establish ourselves in a new direction as a new nation and put ourselves on the world map, which will be compatible with the rest of the world? So these are few of the examples of the works that I wanted to show you. So what I'm trying to say here is that Lahore Art Circle members were not at all interested in promoting a nation state agenda or pronouncing themselves as secular like Bombay Progressive were. Instead, they precariously were managing to establish themselves, not being part of the nationalist rhetoric, but at the same time not defying the formation of Pakistan. So I will come back to it if the time allows. So I want to show you some of the works so that you can get an idea of the kind of work they're producing. So I also briefly want to touch upon why in the beginning I said that, I feel that, this was modeled after Bombay Progressive. One of the things that, Zehra and I have worked together a lot is that, establishing those connections. So the friendships and the familial relations of the two collectives. So beside the point that, beside the fact that, Sayyid Haider Raza and Ali Imam were the two brothers, there were also other binding factor. One is like, the socio-political background was the same for both the groups, and they're both coming from these post-colonial backgrounds. There are several commonalities and differences between the two groups. So even before partition, when Sheikh Safdar Ali is also living in India, he works for Bombay Talkies, and this is where you can see him. This is where Sheikh Safdar Ali is. And when he's working here, he's also friends with M.F. Hussain. And then later on, like, of course, Sheikh Safdar Hussain does not go to England, but the other people go and they reconnect again. So during this time, when they have these Bombay Talkie days, there was another club that they established, which was called as the Muslim Sketch Club, which was established between 1944 to 46. And Safdar and M.F. Hussain were all part of that. So Shakir Ali also studied under Andre Lotte in Paris, and so did Akbar Padamsee and Ram Kumar also studied there. So they must have crossed their paths again. So, I mean, there are lots of things that, you cannot just ignore. And let me take you to, like, this is a picture of Sayyid Ali Imam and Sayyid Haider Raza. Sayyid Ali Imam is on the left side, Sayyid Haider Raza is on the right side. So after, and then we look at, one of the, two of the works from the two artists. So Sayyid Ali Imam on the left side, unfortunately, I was unable to get a color image of this, and I have actually not seen the colored image of this painting. And then you see Sayyid Haider Raza on the right side, the yellow background of the painting. And you just see the similarities between the two artists, their work, how it just like, they're strikingly similar. So the other thing that I came to know during my research is that, after the establishment of Pakistan, Ali Imam comes to Pakistan, and he's with this thinking that, once things settle, like, he's going to go back to India. And this never happened. Sayyid Haider Raza was very upset with his brother that he left India. Sayyid Haider Raza continued to live in India, and I think he went on to Paris during that time. The two of them were really close to each other. They would write postcards, they would write, like, make phone calls. I interviewed his wife, Ali Imam's wife, and she said that, they were really close. What I'm putting up on the screen, I'm sorry, the rest of the text has just gone black. I'm not sure why it happened, but basically what I highlighted is that, in between these card exchanges, the letters they were exchanging, they would talk about everything, but they never talked about, like, exchanging artworks, or like, thinking of like visiting each other in each other's country. So the one paragraph that I highlighted is that, he would update him. Sayyid Haider Raza is writing to Ali Imam that, my paintings are at last back from Germany. Recently, Mr. Jack has visited the studio and liked the work. For the first time, I had my best paintings and my best painting available. He's writing a study for a magazine to be published in March. The painting will leave again for Canada next month. So now the task will be the next Paris exhibition. But somehow he never asked about, like, Ali Imam's work, or like, how he's doing. Ali Imam later on moves to England, to London, and he makes work there, and he lived there for at least 10 years. And to my knowledge, they still didn't like exchange work, or like, physically met in that sense. So this is, I'm going to conclude sort of like, my presentation here, because I really want to leave, I know that there must be a lot of things that you might be thinking, the audience might be thinking. I would like to cover them during the Q&A. So these are the 4 exhibitions that the Lahore Art Circle did under the banner of Lahore Art Circle. And these were like, so the few things that I mentioned was like, not all of the members would be included in each time they would show as a group. So they would show it in the groups of like 2 and 3 and, 4s. I think there was only one time, the 1955 exhibition, where 6 of them showed the work together. So like Zehra mentioned, like, when they moved to London, so this is one of the show opening where, the 2 of the artists, here is Shamsa and here is Saftar, and this is happening at USIS Center, Murray, and this is just an inauguration of that time. You can see the paintings in the background. What I wanted to end my presentation is 2 things. One is that, I wanted to mention you the 3 of these artists, which includes Ali Imam, Amit Pervez, and Anwar Jalal Shamsa, from 1957 onwards, 56 onwards, moved to London, and they, along with 2 artists from East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, Safiuddin Ahmed and Murtaza Bashir, formed another group which was called as Pakistan Group London. And I think the group was showed their work together for a couple of years, and then also it was dissolved. So if I would say that, just concluding on, like, how Zehra mentioned that F.N. Souza and M.F. Hussein's friendship with Ali Imam in London, which culminated to their visits to Pakistan in 70s and exhibited their works at Ali Imam's Indus Gallery in Karachi. This indicates that they must have been in contact with each other in yesteryears. And as Zehra was establishing that, Bombay Progressive was structured and organized group with a clear manifesto, which was not to project themselves as member of a secular India, arguably in line with this Indian state agenda. Turning down Lahore Art Circle, which was founded 5 years later, turning towards Lahore Art Circle, which was founded 5 years later than Bombay Progressive, was also an organized and first of its kind group. Although unlike PGA, there was no formal manifesto discovered for the Lahore Art Circle, but I was able to find one of the meeting minutes of Lahore Art Circle, which shows that it was a well-organized group with ambitions and goals similar to Bombay Progressives. For example, the meeting minute shows that Lahore Art Circle, and I think I have included, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the meeting minutes. This is the meeting minutes that I found. So it just shows that, the group had, like, a proper agenda, like, how often they met, what was their next task, when will they exhibit again, and where will they exhibit again. So these were the kind of things that, one can assess looking at these meeting minutes. So I propose that based on such similarities and differences, a close analysis of the 2 collectives will be critical to understanding the formation and vision of what modern art meant in the 2 countries, and to study the crossovers between the collectives that were direct influences on the 2. Thus, modern art in the context of the Indian subcontinent is complex, but pivotal in shaping the social fabric of the 2 nation states. Thank you. I'll end here.
Samina, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I suppose before we just jump into Puja, I just have a small question. Just tell me, we talk about the PAG and the mythology of the PAG, and the kind of the stories that surround the PAG. In the case of the Lahore Art Circle, is there equally a kind of a large corpus of scholarship that already exists around the group, or really what you're doing in itself is the first time that we're finding out many of the things that you're talking to us about today?
Absolutely. So, when I started my research, I actually was mentioning this to you before. When I started my PhD, I wanted to do my PhD in contemporary art, but then I was taking this class where I was studying about Bombay Progressives. And then I started thinking what was happening in Pakistan at this time when, in India. So Bombay Progressives were formed on, like, specifically on the evening of 1947, at least that's what the scholarship is telling. For us in Pakistan, like, this Lahore Art Circle, one is that, it wasn't really a very well-established fact that, this circle existed. Actually, when I started my research, everybody said Shakir Ali was never part of this, group. And then I find these astonishing meeting minutes, which just shows that, he's the leader for the group. And then, so we didn't really have any scholarship. So let me just say this. So the first 10 years of Pakistani art, it's just really not been explored in depth at all. So the number of reasons are, like, one is that, there is no archives. Also the fact that, it was a time when, the partition happened and there were other pressing issues which were much more important. So there was like no documentation. Even then, when I'm doing my research, I'm finding a lot of these artists work in private collection, and they have done a really good job taking care of that. So I think, in terms of scholarship, so now I think after my research, it has started to generate more of an interest in that sense. Anwar Jalal Shamsa in last 15 years have gained a lot of attention, from England, and his work is now in the collection of Tate and MoMA and Met. So now it's really picking up, but not all of them had the same kind of attention still given to them. So this is what I'm really trying to do, is like bring the focus, highlight.
Well, in that case, I mean, I think we all feel even more fortunate then that we were able to listen to this groundbreaking research. Thank you, Samina.
Thank you.
Puja, I'm going to invite you now to make your presentation. I think you're now going to, rather than talking about larger group formations, you're going to be now focusing on individual artistic practices, which will be really exciting, and looking at the extraordinary Jehangir Nicholson collection as the basis. So over to you, Puja. Thank you.
Thank you, Mort, and thank you, Zehra and Samina, for that very, very insightful perspective and presenting your groundbreaking research to us. Relating to today's subject of collectives, composites, and collaborations, I have explored this in my presentation through the way that one imagines affiliations to a land or culture in the sense of a belonging. And, it's also to argue against some very stringent and purist beliefs that are increasingly prevalent today. The kind that, of a singular reading, making invisible the long history of migrations caused multiple times in our histories due to political historical events, such as the redrawing of national boundaries, or constant migrations of labor, as well as of individual trajectories. So I'm just going to pull up my presentation. Right. So I'm starting with this slide, this work by Zarina Hashmi. Zarina Hashmi is an artist who passed away earlier this year, and her work has consistently explored being and belonging in multiple times and places, relating to her own itinerant life. Zarina has lived variously in like different places around the world, including where she was born, Aligarh, to Bangkok, Delhi, Paris, Bonn, Tokyo, Los Angeles, New York, and London. So using spare forms, reference from maps, borders, architecture, blueprints, and daily objects, her works address the shifting idea of home and belonging through contexts of movement, displacement, loss, and diaspora. So I'm going to present a quote from Zarina here, where she says, "I often wonder what my life would have been like had I never left my house of the four walls in India. I will never know the privilege of living out my days in the country in which I was born, speaking in my mother tongue. There is truth to the phrase, you can never go home again. I do not feel at home anywhere, but the idea of home follows me wherever I go." So in this work, it's titled Cage from the Jnaf Collection, and it's from the 1970s, at a time when Zarina was in Delhi, and she was making prints by rubbing ink on found objects like wood in this case. And here we see how the cage or the idea of home simultaneously becomes sort of a thing of security as well as of confinement. Okay, so, and when we speak of national political borders in the Indian context, Kashmir becomes an inseparable part of how we imagine lines of control within ongoing current contexts of national boundaries and contested lands. Moreover, the perception of Kashmir as this beautiful, idyllic landscape is ruptured with the everyday strife of lived realities in the land, a simultaneous narrative which is expressed through Nilima Sheikh's work. Her work of Kashmir engaged with a sense of displacement and longing. So in that sense, memory and longing become a part of the relationship with a land or a culture. And this side of contestation is also represented through a layering in her works, layering visual image and text. So she uses a range of textual references. And I remember there's in some of her earlier works, there is this line by Aga Shahid Ali that she has used, which says, "My memory gets in the way of your history." So I think it's a really profound expression of lived realities versus the writing of histories. And in this work, of course, the text is by M.K. Raina. It's a first-person account. M.K. Raina is a Kashmiri theater personality as well as a cultural activist who believes that culture can be a counterpoint for violence, against violence. And here you see even the way the works kind of are titled, My Hometown, Recollections. They all kind of speak about this belonging through a memory or an inherited memory or experience. Okay, so this, of course, is Tayyab Mehta's work. And here I want to speak about the representation of the human body. So in my presentation, what I've really focused on is also the way that the figure is represented and the body as a site really for, histories, the representation of histories and kind of migration, labor, all of those things. So the way that this is one work by Tayyab Mehta called Falling Figure, which is one of the first of this series that he did. And it was in response, again, an image from memory, which he saw during the partition, where he saw a man being killed on the street. So obviously it kind of stayed with him as a really traumatic image. And the way that the canvas and the painting is structured, you can see the body, which is kind of abstracted, dismembered, mutilated, more like a mass of flesh rather than an individual kind of identity. Because I think it also becomes a subject of state, or like a subject that is then subjected to trauma or violence. So moving on, these are more works again by Tayyab Mehta, more recognizable works. The Trust Bull series, which on the top left corner, where he houses. So again, the idea of violence and dismemberment in creating the figure or the body, and also the way that he uses color. Color itself is used as kind of slicing of the canvas, and here the canvas is further partitioned through these diagonals that he then comes to. Here again, the figures are kind of non-representation of a particular person, but more in general as a subject. So the Bengal famine of 1943 is believed to have wrecked over 3 million lives across undivided India. And this famine was a direct outcome of British policy for the war effort during the Second World War. And artists like Chitraprasad and Somnath Kaur kind of represented in their works the extent of the devastation. And again, here you see the body as a subject and a site for trauma to be played out. These are works by Altaf in our collection. And so Altaf Mohammadi, of course, he was very inspired by Marxist ideologies. He was also a part of the progressive youth movement in Bombay. So, this reference to the working body or the idea of labor or the laboring body is something that really took up his preoccupation. And you see this figure again made as a figure that is working, that is in action. They're just their bodies in action, and that idea of labor, which is used as a term of not an individual, but like that gets merged into a kind of plural type of a laboring body. So these are works by Sudhir Patwathan, and here is like a very interesting change that we see, where the figure is now the figure of the laboring body, or the labor is not presented as in this kind of abstract way, but also from the perspective of the subject that is being presented. And yeah. And I think there's this work by Sudhir Patwathan called Bhaiya. And in his work, you see this inside, outside, private, public, all of these things kind of playing out. And it's interesting, the title Bhaiya, because of course it means brother, like older brother. And it's also used as a term to call out to a stranger or to hail an auto rickshaw or a cab. But but in Bombay, it has a very specific other meaning connotation as well, which is people from North India. And so here we come again to the idea of migrants and migrant labor. And I understood this word 10 years ago when I moved to Bombay, and I was called Bhaiya by people while explaining my ancestry. But I think what you really see here is also, in sharp contrast to the way that the city is always spoken about as a cosmopolitan place, you also see its xenophobia and its ethnocentrism in some ways in Sudhir Patwathan's work. Here I come to Krishan Khanna's work, and I want to focus on this painting on the left of my presentation. And it looks again like a very abstracted form, but in reality, what Krishan Khanna has said about these works is that it's called rare view, and it's called rare view, and it is if you really look, you can see, faces, you can see hands, you can then start, if you really look, then you start finding forms in the work. And this was created in the 70s when there was he was in Delhi, and in Delhi it was a time when a huge expansion and urbanization was happening, and a lot of construction work. So this is kind of about construction labor. And the image that became really common to see was trucks packed with labor, cattle, tools, implements, all kind of sort of packed together. And then and also these figures were sometimes totally smeared with cement, and almost unrecognizable from the material that they were carrying. So they become dehumanized kind of cargoes. And I've also, this is just to show some of the other works by Krishan Khanna. And just to talk a little bit about this work, Mastiff. So in his work, he has represented dogs in a very different way. So I find it's quite a unique work, because earlier there are works like A Man with Dog and other references in his paintings where they're usually like stray dogs that are also creatures of the street, made alongside the subalterns. So, that kind of subaltern life, that was something that he was very much representing in his work. And here you have the Mastiff, which is, it's got a breed, it's got this sort of very powerful look, and to my mind, be representative of surveillance or state. Okay, so here I come to Jamini Roy's work, and this idea of referencing very wide like an artist can have very wide range of references, and usually Jamini Roy is someone we only kind of identify this sort of work with, where he was really looking at traditional forms, folk art, and Kalighat motifs in his work. But also there was a past where he did sort of do this kind of very post-impressionist work. So just to extend that idea of belonging and migration to also formal language, and the fact that artists do kind of internalize and live with other cultures and other languages. I mean, and you may migrate to a different kind of way of making, but it is still like becomes then a part of an artist's oeuvre or past. And the same thing with Raza. These are the one on the left are works that he did in Paris, and you can see more kind of European references in the way that this is made. And then later, of course, you have the Bindu and his kind of obsession with representing Indianness and Indian culture, and the Bindu being a symbol of that. And the reason that I've put both Jamini and Raza is also because Jamini Roy came much earlier, and then there was Raza. So just to argue against a very linear sort of writing, even of art history, because it's not like it moves from one kind of reference to another, but there's a constant kind of imagining of yourself in relation to the world, and art making in also in that kind of mode or context. This is Souza, again, to speak about the representation of the figure. And here what you see are very grotesque, caricature-like figures. And of course, as we all know, Souza was he was associated with being this very rebellious kind of artist in his life and in his art, like anti-authority and against all kinds of systems. And he himself was actually brought up initially to be a priest. And this, and his works, he's done a lot of these works where he has depicted, themes from the Bible or sort of Catholic references. But then the way that he paints them is in this way. And there's a line the very famous line, of course, by Souza, where he says that in earlier artists, when they were representing biblical themes, or they were like the Renaissance artists, they were painting angels for men, and I am painting for angels to show them what men and women really look like. So you see that kind of contradiction, and again I'm speaking about belonging also in terms of other kinds of belonging, religion or state or nationhood. And so we see that kind of representation of the figure changing in different works. Bhupen Kakkar, again, he's of course an artist, and very bold depictions, and I think one of the first depictions in modern Indian art, modern contemporary Indian art, of homosexuality. And he does it in a very humorous and kind of normalizing way. And also this work, like with a very tongue-in-cheek title, which says he wears his Gandhi topi, which again is interesting because it speaks about patriotism and also but legalization and inclusion of alternate sexualities. So just to end this work by Sundaram, and it is from 91, which is the year that liberalization happened in India, and India sort of opened up to world markets. And this sort of brought a whole kind of global markets in, as well as imagining of the world. And you see a lot of artworks around this time, referencing very specific events in like world events. And so this is of course from the Gulf War and its implications also on India. And here you see the figure of Saddam Hussein kind of embedded in war imagery, and also smears of engine oil. And later Vivan started making a lot more three-dimensional and experimenting with other forms and materials. So yeah, so I think that just one more thing. Yeah, so I think to sum up my presentation is to address the question of belonging, whether it is country, state, religion, and also the body as a site for these contexts to play out or adhere to or transgress. And you know, most of the works that I've selected present they have some kind of questioning of the normative or the mainstream narrative to have like a more nuanced understanding and a more plural understanding of how we imagine cultures and belonging. So I will end here.
Thank you, Puja. Thank you, Puja. I mean, as you say, a lot of the works take on this more nuanced view. In fact, some of overtly political. I just wonder whether we have, do we know whether Jehangir Nicholson, the collector, of course, responsible for the acquisitions, does he ever talk about his own passion behind some of these political ideas? Does he go on record, or do you think he's engaged with the ideas that are embedded with so many of the works?
So I'm not sure. I think for him, collecting became kind of having what is going on. So I know that he became really experimental in his choices of what he would collect. And so we do have, I mean, I don't think the works have before been linked like this in a very political, you know, way. But I mean, these are just connections that I've made now. But I think for him, it was more kind of having what is going on and what is contemporary to his time.
Yeah, sort of representing the now, as it were.
Yeah.
So thank you, Puja. So now moving from one extraordinary collection to another extraordinary collection, though I think, Siddhartha, today maybe you're not going to be talking so much about the Hurwitz group. And I think today your subject will be more to do with diaspora artists and artists working from out in, you know, the larger context outside of India. Very excited to listen to this, Siddhartha. So over to you, sir.
Great, thank you, Mort. Thank you, everyone. These are such wonderful, exciting presentations. And you're right, I am not looking at the Hurwitz collection today. Can someone confirm that you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
okay, great. Okay, thank you. So think of this as a coda, as an ending to this series that's opening up other possibilities. I'm going to quickly go through these so we have ample opportunity to ask questions about the presentations we saw earlier. But the whole series of three talks that we've done have really been about questioning dominant narratives and dominant categories like the modern and the contemporary. And I would say that there is a dominance in the discourse around modern and contemporary Indian art that looks to nationhood, identities of one's attachment or connection to Indianness, and relating things back to partition. But for many of us, I'll speak for myself here, of the diaspora, our Indianness is not linked to nationhood. It is a generalized cultural identity. So an Indian American and a Pakistani Canadian, we find connections here because we are both more or less from generally over there, and we find ourselves generally here. So it forms a kind of, it's us versus them, the dominant American identity, of which I am never passing. So this more complicated sense of self or connection to place is what I'm looking at today. It's easy to polarize modern and contemporary abstraction and figuration, but those gloss over a lot of these experiences and voices. So when talking about queering South Asia, I'm not using this in the way we think of it typically, which is in the context of sexual and gender identity, although that can enter here. But it's in thinking about my work at an American museum and asking, how is my work here going to be relevant to the future, which includes a lot of biracial people, transcultural people. So the language itself is queer, looking at these more complicated identities. So I'm starting with some well-known work like an Indian from India series by Anu Matthew, which connected the histories of photography in the US and India and that particular phenomenon that happens here of having to specify what kind of Indian you are, and the feather Indian versus dot Indian, which are these terms that have been used to differentiate us. But also the shared American perception of the other, but this important counterpoint that as immigrants, we are implicated in a system that has taken the land and resources from these native people. So while there's the red Indian, brown Indian, dot Indian, feather Indian, and we both read as brown, there's a polar opposition between an indigenous identity and that of an immigrant. Or I think of the work of Salman Tur, and I ask repeatedly, so Salman is born in Pakistan, based in New York. What does it tell us when his work is introduced, when he is introduced as a Pakistani artist or a queer artist, and what does that actually hinder us from seeing? He turns regularly and directly to Western art history, like this work inspired by Iqbal at the Folies Bergère by Manet, but then places South Asian characters into them, thrown into the mix. Queer works that are often about interracial interaction, sharing an intimate space. To me, his paintings are like a love letter to New York City or a utopian vision of the East Village, nostalgic, queer, youthful, and current. It's a world in which Pakistani does not stand for not from India or Muslim, but rather one who is different, who finds community, place, and comfort with others who are themselves different. So it's not us versus them, it's us and the world that we create together. But what really interests me about a lot of the work being done in the diaspora returns to what I talked about last week, which was mythology or myth making. That from the subcontinents with its rich wellspring of epics and descriptions of beings with animals and attributes and adornments, it makes sense that there would be an exploration into the realms of the divine and the supernatural. Huma Baba, for one, where her objects are all these powerful figures, monumental and sacred, foreboding, ancient, like ancient artifacts unearthed on a dig, but also futuristic, and figures that she herself has talked about as hermaphrodites, having a multiple sexuality. And then there are immediate and rather blatant references to the idea of the alien, which is taking me to what I'm most excited about diasporic art. Turning ideals of just a nationhood on its head and looking at much bigger issues of belonging. And some of these I read as colonizing fantasies, or colonizing threats, those that have descended and might take over. And we see this regularly in the work of some artists today. Saks Afridi, an artist born in Peshawar who's based in New York City, who has created this, a myth of the space mosque, a fantasy in which a vessel came to the earth and fulfilled one prayer for every human being every 24 hours. But then something happened, the vessel disappeared, and people's memories were erased of this phenomenon. It was only realized through artifacts dug up in the earth, like this prayer catcher. So he's created a mythology. And it was called Space Mosque by Islamophobic journalists. So this is where he is looking at I mean, too many things to go into, but we're going into the outer space. And I'd like to think about how Afrofuturism has been a thing where African diaspora cultures have looked at the intersection of technology and science fiction to imagine alternative realities. And we see artists of South Asian descent doing the same. Turning briefly to Nep Sidhu, a Canadian artist who is deeply connected to his Sikh roots and identity. And these are paintings on canvas, but with cotton embroidery. So really kind of looking to like Fulkari shawls to do his work. And has also created objects like this, a return carrier soaked in call and equation, and this ring that is almost modernizing the sacred in a way. And then there's Rajni Pereira. I'm ending with Rajni Pereira's work, a Sri Lankan artist in Canada who visualizes travelers of an indecipherable background who move between worlds and planets. They're nomadic beings that are caught in between spaces, tribal but powerful, as if they're seeking to land somewhere. And she actually styles herself as one in a series of recent photographs. And what I find fascinating about them is that there's something to me that's threatening about them. We don't know where they're going, where they're from, what they're capable of, or what their intentions are. And so I look at these as constructing new truths beyond our prevailing narratives, beings who are disconnected maybe from a specific past, but carry the traumas, just like I myself, as an Indian in America, have an internal split between my cultural identity, but likely carry the traumas of partition that my ancestors carried. Can these queer South Asian identities reclaim agency over particular narratives that have been perpetuated by nation states? Can a people who have endured the traumas of colonialism and internal severing imagine other futures? And can we in this field continue to question and nuance the dichotomies of India, Pakistan, modern and contemporary, while paying close attention to all those who dwell in the spaces in between or beyond those limiting frameworks? So I'm ending there and opening it up to our questions.
Thank you so much, Siddhartha. And if I may just perhaps ask you a question about your presentation. And it's really about how the reception to diaspora artists has been in the US over the past, let's say, 10 years or so. Is there a growing appreciation of the work of diaspora artists? Is it a nuanced reading, or does it come with the same old baggage of pigeonholing, which obviously has been the case so often with works by South Asians, quote unquote?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that diaspora is still framed within like a diaspora exhibition. I mean, and I'm speaking, things are different in Canada. Like, I'm really impressed with the way that some of these artists' works are shown in Canada, where diaspora is not necessarily the label put over them, but in the US, I do find often that we use that label of diaspora. What I'm proposing, which I unfortunately no longer have the time to do because of my new role at the museum, is I really think there's something in a vision of South Asian futurism. And it's South Asian futurism that is coming out of artists who not only do not find a place of home in India or Pakistan, or with the narrative of that split and partition, but don't fit in here as well, and are turning to a futuristic place. And just in brief, I'll also say, just like a lot of the conversation about race happening in the United States right now is looking at racialized trauma, where someone who might not have lived through the civil rights movement, let's say a Black person in the United States, might not have memory of being implicated in slavery, will carry the ancestral traumas of that. Yeah. And I'm really wondering whether I carry the traumas of partition, not as a lived experience or anything even my parents went through, but as an ancestral baggage, so that my diasporic identity is now reframing that whole thing into conquering planets and outer space, that's when it gets really freaky.
Yeah. And I would point to an artist in the UK, someone like Shehzad Dawood, who I think deals head on with this idea of futurism in his own practice. Again, quoting often from his Pakistani heritage, but then taking it into this quite other kind of space as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for your presentations. I do want to just pick up on Puja's presentation. I have a lovely comment from Tasneem, Tasneem Mehta, which I'd just like to read out. She says that she just has a quick observation that Jehangir Nicholson and her were on the NGMA board for a couple of terms and were good friends. And she says he was definitely politically aware of what he was doing, but I don't think any of us were as politically charged at that time because India was a very different place then. I think just the act of collecting modern art was a politically conscious statement at that time, as Puja said. I'm sure he was conscious of the political resonances of these works though. And I find that very interesting that she sort of says the act of collecting itself becomes politically charged. And I think she's absolutely right in picking up, I think, on what we had said in the first session around the idea of collecting and what collecting can mean. Okay, I'd like to now take us slightly back to our earlier conversation around the idea of modernism in Pakistan, and something which Puja actually mentioned when she was looking at the work of Jamni Roy and Raza. She said, listen, I want to look at these histories in a non-linear way, and I'm interested in the way that artists imagine themselves against the world. Right? So what I found interesting there is it almost seems to be picking up on an idea of an art movement that, in this case, I'm going to take on modernism, where artists perhaps are restaging their understanding of modernism at every moment of their career. So rather than maybe having these linear progressions of an Indian modernism or a Pakistani modernism, instead we have individual artists who are sort of coming to what is modernism in their own practices at an individual level. And I wonder whether that resonates with us as a group, and whether there are any specific artists or artistic practices that we'd like to talk about. I mean, from my own perspective, obviously Samina's extraordinary juxtaposition of the Ali Imam and the Raza works seems to deny any kind of linear Indian modernism or Pakistani modernism, because here we have two guys probably coming out of, and I think it's interesting that Samina mentioned the Ali Imam JJ school connection as well, because it seems that there's a quite different kind of connection there happening. So thoughts, impressions, or reactions to that statement?
I'll go first. So I think you're absolutely right. In terms of so I just have to say, this presentation was just really the introduction of this group. And I'm sorry that I didn't have a chance to go into the analysis and present more in detail or in depth, my study. But let me just say that, so my idea, I tried to cover a lot of things, putting a lot of slides, juxtapositioning them together, so one of the things, if you notice, when I showed the slides of these modernist artists, this group is, they all came together in terms of the ideology of doing something new. But I think in terms of they were not really following a single movement. They were just really sort of together because they believe that they need to break away from the prevalent practices, find something new to do. So I think just the idea, one of the scholar, Michael Ledger, talks about why people form groups. And the idea is to provide that kind of insight and, exchange of ideas. So even for these, some of the things that, I have researched and looked up is very interesting is that they would sometime have a dialogue on certain things which were coming from their popular culture at that time. For instance, the idea of anarkali. So one would start painting anarkali in his way. So at that time, this play, and there was a movie that came out at that time. So one of the artists starts painting anarkali, and it is entirely different from the somebody, which Shamsa, so I should say, I think I showed one of the painting was from Muin Najmi, and Shamsa paints anarkali completely in a different way. So if I could show the, comparison, so they were like, the ideas were reflected and refracted, but they had their own very individual style. So I would refrain from labeling them under saying like, okay, they were all following the Cubist style, or like, they were all, yes, they were engaging with multiple movements, and they were not like really centered towards like Paris or like Munich, but they're like looking at everything around. So I think in that sense, you're right. Like, so there is no linearity, like, and then especially in the context of South Asia, we put on, we are put on under this pressure, like, well, the modern art is delayed, or is it like, derivative, or were they like really copying? And I think that is really, it's a time that we break these, kind of like cliches, because that's not true. I mean, it's like, it's a very complicated and longer debate, but the point is that, and it's also the question of like, this reciprocity. Like, so when West look at something that is like Islamic, or is it something African mask or something, you take that as like a modern movement, like, it's called as some way other. But then, when the periphery follows that, or like, they are inspired by something, or they engage in these kind of, practices, it's just unfair to call it like, the derivatives and the delayed ones. So just wanted to just put it out, like, so you're right in terms of linearity. There's no linearity to it.
Yeah.
I also wonder though, also, what's kind of, it's like a double bind, because on the one hand, what we're all trying to do in different ways is create an art history for the material that we deal with, whether you call it Indian or Pakistani or South Asian or Black, I mean, depending on whatever your definition is. And many of us, on this are actually doing it within institutional structures, sometimes within Western institutional structures. Samina and I are forced to work quite a lot because that's just where we're given our points at which we can connect from Western institutions. So those are the platforms that we are working with. And so one bind is the fact that, we need to create a narrative to sort of persuade the Western other, and I don't want to like kind of, make it into a kind of West versus us sort of thing. But however you term it, we need to create a narrative that says, look, what we're doing is slightly different from what you guys have, and what we can add to you is something a little bit different. So that's one bind, where we also have to argue for our own positions as scholars with, different kind of material. And the easiest way to do that is saying, oh, I'm a South Asian art historian. And then on the other hand, is the thing of, we want to kind of contest that. We want to contest that category, what it means, to be forced into nation-centric dialogues, and also acknowledge the fact that, these are really porous boundaries, and the fact is, what India meant in the 50s to a Raza might actually, even at the very same time, have meant something quite different to a Sousa sitting, in London. And all of these issues are like, they're specific, and so even though we have a word and a banner to put it under, which is like Indian or Pakistani or, a progressive artist group or Lahore Art Circle. In fact, there's so many like sort of arbitrary things that make up those decisions.
Yeah. And do you think that we're done a slight disservice by the fact that a lot of the history comes with, or at least in the Indian context, especially in the 80s with the festivals of India and the other kind of, this kind of exporting of Indian culture abroad, came with a lot of state intervention, and that in some ways Indian modernism or Indian art became packaged in a certain manner, and that some of these nuances then got left out. Is that a problem, number one? Number two, to Samina, I just wonder, in the case of Pakistan, was there also a move to package the Pakistani art scene and export it for a use as soft power, as it were, in a cultural sense at any point in time?
Samina, you're on mute.
Sorry, Zehra, do you want to go first or you want me to
No,
address?
you
Okay.
go first.
So that's a very interesting question, and it's just really very tricky as well. But so let me just start by saying, like, you know, so these artists, so I'm really specifically talking in the context of Lahore Art Circle. So these artists, when they are doing the work, you know, they are really, as I stated, like, you know, they're really not trying to follow a nationalist rhetoric, like, you know, so unspokenly, Chughtai becomes the face of Pakistani art, like, you know, because it's just very nicely fitted into that narrative of, like, you know, the past nostalgia of like Islamic, you know, miniature Persian kind of thing. So for these guys to take away from, you know, the prevalent practices, they're trying to establish themselves. And I made the point that, you know, but they were also very mindful of the fact that they belong to Pakistan and they have moved to Pakistan. So they were very conscious about it. I think for them, the most important thing was to be acknowledged as, you know, compatible and on equal footing with the rest of the, you know, world, like on the international art scene. Having said that, I also want to take your attention to this point where, like, you know, I showed the last slide where I showed you the image where I talked about they formed a group which was called as Pakistan Group in London. So I think, you know, so one cannot deny that, you know, there are times, you know, so this whole idea of identity, it's very complicated. So if for them, you know, to answer your question, you know, whether they wanted to package themselves in a certain way, I don't think that was the agenda. You know, they were really sort of experimenting, and especially, like, you know, for my research, I call the kind of modern art practice they were following was really kind of heuristic. What I mean by that is, like, you know, going back to your question of, like, you know, there's no linearity. So they're kind of going back and forth. Sometimes they're like totally abstract. And then they go back and start drawing these very figurative images. So it's kind of like, you know, this play of like certainty and uncertainty, but like really not in that sense, like in a negative sentence, but in more a productive sense that, you know, they're trying to explore more venues. They're trying to explore things in that sense. But I really don't think that they were really, you know, the slides that I showed you guys, you know, it's just really not in any sense showing like anything that is like really, you can label it as Pakistani in that sense. Yeah. But yes, when they move to London, it becomes important for them to establish their group as Pakistan Group of London. So again, the whole idea, like, why would you, you know, establish a group? So I think that just brings a little complicated dynamic in that.
And there's something that Samina and I were also like looking at, and hopefully we'll get more of an opportunity to sort of explore this. You know, when COVID happened, was this sort of the idea of group dynamics as well, and the fact that, you know, so the progressives who move away to London and Paris and, you know, all of that, they no longer you know, they're no longer really attached to a kind of a new group identity in the West. And Sousa is a really good example, right? So when he makes it in London in the sort of the second part of the 50s and the early 60s, he would, I mean, you know, the way he talks about himself, he would much rather associate with a Bacon, you know, Graham Sutherland. These are he doesn't want to associate sort of with a kind of an Indian group. But what is really interesting is that, you know, for the Pakistani artists, their sort of association with the Pakistani group is almost like a way of saying, okay, let's bandy together and let's get some kind of traction, which we're not going to get as individuals. And so maybe part of it is also about success, as to which one of them actually managed to get a little bit of success. And those don't really need to fall back on a group identity anymore. So what's really interesting is that, you know, Sousa's half-brother, Ribeiro, now, the first thing he does when he realizes that, you know, he'd been really successful in Bombay, he came to London thinking, oh, he's also going to make it like Sousa, but he doesn't make it. So what does he do? He forms a group.
Right. So if I may, I'm going to now just take that idea of, especially what Samina said about the Lahore, when the group goes to London, you get the Pakistan group. Siddhartha, to what extent do you feel an ambassadorial role for work from the region, sitting as you are in a space totally exiled, as it were, from the hurly-burly of either Lahore or Bombay or Delhi or what have you. To what extent do you feel an ambassadorial role, and to what extent do you feel able to tell the more nuanced stories behind the individual artistic practice? And how have you navigated between these two poles, especially with the new rehang, which is coming up in November?
Wow, Mort, great question. It's first of all, it's very difficult to tell very in-depth stories in the gallery setting, just because of the realities of how much time the general public spends in front of a label. So, you know, we as an institution are, I believe, the only art museum that has a neuroscientist on staff. And this has been really great to get information about just the human experience in exhibitions. And what we have assessed is that a person looks at a wall, like wall text, typically less than 2 seconds. So they often look to see if they recognize the name. Is this like an artist I've heard of? And then like, where are they from and what's the name? And then you can look at a bunch of words, but we don't really process it. So I've had to take that into consideration. So there's very little in-depth, you know, going into the stories of the artists that exists in the gallery. And that is things that I will do more through talks or conversations like this, so that if people want to find more information, they can go online, they can find a platform for it. So in terms of being an ambassador, I feel that I have a role as an ambassador to keep the culture. So in our case, it's Indo-centric, the culture of this Indian collection alive and relevant to the public, not just the Indian public here or the South Asian, but to the broader public that is here. I do not feel any obligation to perpetuate ideas or stories or like the canon of the past, which is why, though we have a canonical collection and you will see works by some of the heavy hitters that we're all familiar with, Zehra knows I've really made it a priority to not perpetuate those ideas, but show the work of artists that I believe have been overlooked, and narratives that have not like been considered.
Yeah. And I think since we're all guests of Pujas today, I think also it's important to note the fact that in your new role at JNAF, clearly having talks and seminars series such as this is part of your own agenda now, and I presume going forward in terms of the curatorial program you have at the museum itself. And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how you see your role developing in COVID times, in post-COVID times, and especially again, you're now talking to a pretty clued-in audience. You're talking to a Bombay audience. These are mostly seasoned gallery goers, people who are aware of or think that they're pretty much aware of our own art history. How will you go about creating these nuances, opening up these little gaps, as it were?
Thank you. So I think these talks were like a first step in opening out the collection, and also like letting people see what is there, you know, speaking about it through different contexts. And the other thing is that for me, it was very interesting to be at the JNF because modern Indian art for me, and I've studied in Baroda, I've taught it, I was lecturer there as well. It's a part of art history I would still say that is ignored. And because I have learned so much just looking at the collection. You know, I've learned about artists that I didn't even know. I mean, I knew that they existed, but I hadn't really engaged with their works. Even the Bombay progressives were, the general way of looking at it is like, okay, you've seen one Hussain, you've seen them all. You've seen a Raza, you've seen them all. You know, and I'm guilty of that as well. So I think that it's been very interesting and challenging for me to have these talks and to be with the collection to really understand what really happened at that point, but how do we navigate and how do we negotiate history with this contemporary space. And the way that I look at going forward, of course, in the lockdown time, it's going to be through conversations like this. But going forward, I also want to see what kind of collaborations we can do with contemporary artists, maybe to reflect on the collection and the larger context of the museum as well. You know, because the museum, I mean, we are a part of the CSMBS Museum, which is kind of like an encyclopedic museum. It has Harappa, Indus Valley, it has like miniature paintings, it has a whole Himalayan art section. So there are like lots of Japanese, and I have actually started having conversations with a couple of artists to see what we can do, you know, along with our collection. So I think to kind of make connections beyond only retrospective shows, though I think retrospective shows are also important because there's not enough material out there. Like I feel the one thing that we really lack in Indian art history is that there isn't information. I mean, if I want to understand about it, and so many people are now asking me, you know, what are the books to read, or is there some platform or some way that you can understand, you know, modern and contemporary Indian art? And I don't think there's enough. There's a lot, but there's not enough. And I think there are newer contexts that we need to look at. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly the lockdown at least has provided a lot more of these kinds of situations, which I think will.
I feel like the first few months that I was at JNF, it just sort of gets taken up by so many administrative things. So I think it's really given a chance to also kind of reflect on collections, on what we think of contemporary art, modern art, all of that. Yeah.
Well, for me, I would just like to make the point that, you know, we set out at the first lecture, you know, thinking about the relevance of the modern in the contemporary space. And just before that first lecture, there was a large newspaper article about a world record price for an artist that had been made just that previous week. Just before today's lecture, lots of newspaper stories in Pakistan about a major modernist artist and the ructions going on in a museum. So it's clear that modern art, whether we like it or not, is very much present in our contemporary space. So I think the work that we're all doing, just by its very nature, has an urgency to it, which I think we should all be conscious of, and not think that somehow we are talking to the past. I think we're very much talking to the present. And I hope that's something the audience also has got out of these three lectures. It is now 8:40 in India, Puja. Should we perhaps wind down?
Yeah, we can wind down unless we have a question. I also want to say I see some hands raised. So if there is a question, then if you can type it out in the Q&A. But if there are no more questions, then we can close now.
Well, certainly I hope that there are more opportunities for Samina to speak to Indian audiences. And I hope that we can make that happen amongst all of us. And I think that this is only the beginning of kind of understanding the relationships between the different schools and movements that were operating across borders at the outset of the modernist period in the two countries. So for my sake, Samina, please come and lecture again. That would be really fantastic.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. Would love to.
I just want to say thank you so much, Sameena, Siddharth, Zehra, especially Siddharth and Zehra. We have been speaking every week since 3 months or 4 months maybe. And it's been quite interesting. I think I'm going to miss these weekly conversations and catch-ups that we've had because it's been so insightful, you know, even beyond just what we have presented today. So thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Puja. And it's true, like what our field needs is this. It's like looking across collections, across continents, across countries to put our heads together and move it forward. It's been really an honor, and we need to do more things like this.
So thank you everybody, and also to Mort for like bringing it together for us twice. And yeah, this was quite a feat, this panel, to get it all like sort of together. So thank you, Mort.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Zehra.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.